This live stream event is presented with support from Beneficial State Bank.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Mother Jones live stream. I'm Ali Breland, a tech and disinformation reporter at Mother Jones, and I want to give a quick thanks to Beneficial State Bank, who is sponsoring this event. Today, I'm excited to speak with Ellen Pao. If you're unfamiliar, Ellen Pao is an investor and advocate. She was previously the CEO of Reddit. She's the author of Reset, My Fight for Inclusion and Lasting Change, a book chronicling her life and experiences in Silicon Valley. And in particular, it goes over her battle with the venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins, her former employer, over the discrimination she faced while she was working there. During her time at Reddit, she steered the company towards important milestone decisions like banning revenge porn and unauthorized nude photos. She also had a front row seat for Gamergate, the sexist harassment campaign that laid the framework for a lot of the darker sides of the internet that we now see. Currently, she's the CEO of Project Include, a nonprofit focused on rectifying the problems of diversity and inclusion in tech, or lack thereof. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. Your old company, Reddit, is about to IPO. I was kind of curious to hear about the impact that might have on users. Reddit's sort of danced on this interesting line between sometimes being seen as a company that is on the sort of vanguard. You certainly made vanguard type decisions when you were there, but at the same time has also been seen as a sort of node for some of the more toxic types of behaviors online.
Yeah, it's always been on that edge. I think it started being a kind of a free-for-all, and it hid behind the free speech excuse, and now it wants to be a better player, but I think it doesn't have the stomach for the amount of work that's required. And I also think going public is not a good sign for trying to stem harassment, trying to limit the amount of engagement, because all of a sudden, as a public company, you're measured on engagement. You're measured on the amount of interactions, not the quality or the type of interactions.
So Reddit's kind of always been beholden to, I guess, the sort of investor class and the shareholders, so to speak. Is that going to be even harder now that it's not just people that the leadership team can talk to, but that it's just sort of a faceless, rough set of investors that might not be as interested in maintaining relationships with the companies? Is that more of a difficult thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some investors who are more active and are, you see more investor activism these days. So I think that makes it harder, but I don't know that, I think the bigger thing I'd be worried about is regulation.
Sorry, what do you mean by that? From Reddit's perspective, or just generally regulation coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, I think, I think people are kind of seeing the toxicity. They're understanding the impact of that toxicity. That you're seeing, people who are being harmed. The president of the United States is one of the people who is becoming, under attack from harassment, from fake news, from all of this type of bad behavior. You're seeing people in the Senate, people in Congress. It's become so prevalent that it's impacting people's lives who have the power to actually do something about it. And I think once they've experienced it, you end up realizing that something should be done.
To the agreement that there needs to be regulation. I think that this is one of the few things right now that I think both sides of Congress and the government agree on, Republicans and Democrats. This is a rare point, where Democrats are willing to agree with Ted Cruz on. If you were sitting down and advising members of Congress on what kinds of regulations were needed to sort of rectify these issues of disinformation and toxic speech on these platforms, what would you be telling them they need to do? Because for as much as they talk about regulation, I don't know if there's forward progress on it right now that I'm seeing.
I think the biggest thing is transparency. We need to understand what's actually happening, and you can't right now, right? You can't see behind the doors, how many people are complaining about being harassed or, or about other types of harm, and how many are actually being responded to, and what is the outcome of those different types of reports. And then also, what are the big numbers? I think Facebook has had some leak from employees or ex-employees, and the numbers are not good. and the impact is pretty clear. And let's get a connection between like what's actually happening on these sites and what they're doing about it. So what kind of metrics are they using to try to measure? It doesn't seem like their metrics are effective. So I think it'd be great to have some regulation on like, hey, you need to be responsive in certain ways. You need to address these types of harm, or we're going to come after you, or the people can actually sue you for it who are harmed, because you do have the ability to control it. It's not this like, oh, there's so much of it, we don't know what to do, it's impossible, right? Like that's actually not the case.
Are you amenable at all to, I guess, like the suggestion that these companies ought to be broken up? I've seen arguments on both sides. Some people think that this will like create new types of problems. Other people say that this will make companies less powerful. I don't know. What's your take? Like,
I think the problem is the leadership, right? Like, so let's say we split up Facebook, and then each leader gets a piece of it. They have the same culture, they have the same framework, they have the same process for dealing with things or not dealing with harm. And like, how does that change? Like, all of the impact on the culture and the company comes from the top. And if it's like the same people doing the same things, it doesn't matter how big or how small it is, it's just going to continue the same. I don't see that as being drastic enough, and I don't see that as changing the right things.
mm-hmm.
I mean, it's tied to different incentives, right? You'd have to have some reason for people to actually change what they're doing. Just breaking it up means, oh, for some people, it'll be like, great, now I'm CEO of a company. I never thought I'd be CEO, but now I actually get to run this on my own. Like, for them, they might see it as a good thing. Like, oh, breaking up is actually good. So I have more power and I have more control. I'm going to do more of the same, but I get all the benefit.
How do you think those incentives are realigned? In some ways, like, these companies like Facebook and Twitter, and then Reddit to a lesser degree, and YouTube are doing a very, very good job within the sort of parameters of the incentives that they have to operate by. Their shareholders, up until a couple of days ago, were very happy. If you zoom out, like, the chart still looks like relatively good. The stock charts for these companies, they're very good at doing like what they're supposed to under this incentive structure. Is there a way to do that within the current economic order that incentivizes like quote unquote better behavior?
It's you get to the point where like, hey, maybe they should be held liable. Like, the incentive is you get fined either by the government, or you get fined by having to pay out big judgments to people who are being harmed, or to the organizations. I think there has to be some method of holding people accountable, which we have not. Right? We've had all sorts of really horrific harms. If you look at what's going on with COVID, I think a lot of people agree that much of the failure for people to take precautions, to mask, to get vaccinated, comes from a lot of misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms. And they're starting to clean it up, but it was very slow, and it took a lot of public outcries. It took people dying, and it took just a really long time before the changes actually happened to start taking down some of that content, which was very obviously causing harm and very obviously untrue.
Yeah. One sort of, I guess, like, less popular argument that I've started for, or solution be touted, is that like potentially like nationalizing these companies in the style that you would have for like a BBC, but like crossified that strategies to like social media, would be a potential scenario or a potential solution. Obviously, I think Silicon Valley would be very, very averse to that kind of thing. I mean, what do you think of that kind of strategy?
It makes sense from a theoretical perspective. Like, these people are doing a terrible job, and it really is something that everybody uses every day. It functions almost like a utility.
Yeah,
it functions as a utility for many people, right? This is where they get their information. This is how they communicate with people. But I don't know that the government has the ability to run something, run something of this scale in a way that's actually going to be effective. And a lot of the work is cleanup work. Like, you need to clean up a lot of stuff, and it's not just, okay, we've got all the pipes and now we're just going to run them. We need to like clean up all these algorithms. We need to maybe get rid of maybe we go back to the traditional, like, if I'm not a public company and I'm just a government and I don't have to show huge returns or huge engagement, maybe it's just I'm just showing the content chronologically, right? Like I don't push content to you, I don't push users, I don't push false conspiracy, misinformation. I'm just giving you what it is, just like a phone conversation. I'm not pushing certain calls to you unless you've requested it in your favorites and you've set some setting. I'm just allowing the information to come through, and that's maybe what we should have these. That's what we would do if the government took over. I just find it very hard to imagine that that would be. Maybe we can regulate around it, like hey, regulate around the algorithms, regulate around the misinformation, because I can't see like the government coming in and actually doing a lot of it.
Let's go to a hypothetical world that doesn't exist. Like everything is the same in this world, except these companies don't exist yet. We want them to exist. You're tasked with creating, new social media companies from the ground up. Without giving like product specifics or anything like that. Like, what does a better social media platform look like where you don't have hacked accounts like the one we just saw helping exacerbate, this like truck convoy that's like happening on social media or things like that, or 2016 Russian intervention or things like that?
I think it looks like it's an inclusive company, right? It has people who are not only or almost only white men who start it and who have the ability to make decisions and who are, designing the product and designing it around their own experiences, right? I think there's a huge gap in how we think about building product when we don't have the people who are our users represented across the board. And I think you see all of this harm, and a lot of it is happening disproportionately to people who are Black, to people who are Asian, to people who are Latinx, to people who are Indigenous, and especially to people who are women or non-binary from those groups, to people who are, LGBTQ, to people who are older, like all of the people who are harmed in society, they feel it a lot more. They feel a lot more harassment on the social media platforms.
Are there like any specific tools that you would do away with or features? I can't remember off the top of my head who I want to say said this, but I feel like someone at Twitter talked about regretting the retweet because it was just like giving this dangerous weapon out that did not have good checks on it. Are there things like that that you see that irk you, that like you wish could be put away but just can't be for momentum or inertia or whatever reason?
I think like trending tweets, like the algorithm, I think both of those are designed to amplify noise and amplify like engagement that is very, very often negative.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I feel like half the time I go to trending tweets to see whatever the issue is, there's like a large amount of people by then who are now mad about whatever the trending tweet is, and often not unjustifiably, but it's just like difficult to parse out like what's actually going on. And yeah, like it does, like I guess sort of encourage this like not virtuous circle discourse. Um, Sort of like another founding feature that maybe would be contested in this hypothetical world would be this like this bit of free speech that was like very tightly like latched onto the companies at their earliest stages. I thought that you had a really good quote on this where you've talked about how free speech is almost used. You believe in free speech in like the government sense, like I think most of everyone does, but in terms of the companies, it's like a marketing ploy that they slap onto their companies to sort of imbue themselves with this like I guess like virtuous purpose for why they exist. I was curious if you could like explain that a little bit more.
Sure. I think in the beginning when people started these platforms, they didn't. I believe that they didn't intend for them to be harassment filled, right? They didn't intend for the harassment and the hate and all the bad interactions, but they also didn't experience that much of it in the beginning, right? It wasn't happening to people who look like them. Like, as white men, they were able to roam pretty freely, and especially having created these platforms. So what ended up happening is, all this bad stuff started coming on into their platforms and into the communities, and they didn't want to deal with it. Like, it's not pleasant to go through and like basically like remove content. It's like very it's not the work that people are valued for. It's not shiny and new and exciting. It's kind of like you're doing the kind of cleanup work, which isn't fun. And so they said, you know what, like let's just let it be. Let's just leave all of it. We're not going to do any work on it. And, you know, they found that, oh, if I say it's free speech, even though I'm not the government, I'm a private company, I can hide behind that and it will free me up from having to do all this work. It's not consistent, because at the same time they were getting rid of spam, they were mostly getting rid of child pornography, they deleted a lot of ISIS-related content, but there was this feeling that I can hide behind this free speech banner, and anytime somebody complains about harassment, I'm going to wave this free speech banner to say, like we don't want to censor people, right? As if, making room for many voices is censoring, the loudest voice. It's been fascinating to see how strongly that idea has taken hold and how often it comes up. And the whole goal was to have this place for free ideas, but when you promote a free-for-all behind the guise of free speech, you end up having the loudest voices win and the meanest voices win, because they drown out and they push off every other voice. So you don't really have a market for free ideas. And something that a lot of people like to overlook is the fact that, like, you screaming curse words at somebody is not a market of free ideas. Like, that's not adding anything to the discussion, to call people slurs and to tell them to that you're going to do terrible things to them. Like, that's not an idea that's worth protecting or sharing.
Yeah. That quote kind of also too made me think about this like inadvertent effect that framing has had, in that like it sort of imbues like this like government like aspect onto these companies, and this sort of like this like democratic function to them, which doesn't exist. Like, they are, a lot of people like to make the argument that tech is like democratic, and in some ways it does like advance people's voices, but these companies like fundamentally are undemocratic. Like, I have no ability, or very little ability, to like control anything that Facebook does. I can't vote anyone out there unless I buy. I mean, the shareholders don't even have the ability to do that in the way that like the stock has been structured. I don't know. That kind of, I guess, like ends up making this all sit in a bit of a weird place to me.
Yeah, I think, it was like Jack Dorsey said, like, oh, I'm going to build the public town square in a digital format with Twitter. But, there's still rules in a public town square. Like, you can't, one of my friends is like, you can't throw feces at somebody's face, but people are doing that all day long on the digital town square. It's not, like, these comparisons are limited because digital has this power to spread information so quickly, to allow people to pile on to individuals in a very negative and harmful way. And, and a lot of it, people then said, oh, well, the digital, it's just digital and people need thicker skins and it doesn't happen in real life. But then we are seeing now a lot of organizing is happening in real life. Like, people are marching in Charlottesville, people are swatting people, like, there's a lot of, you can't like contain it online. Like, all of these feelings and these actions spread into real life and offline, and it is causing a lot of harm.
To the very, very slight credit of these companies, I think that they've, even though they were founded on this, like, I guess, like rough free speech principle that has produced all this noxious stuff, like you just said, they have at the very least sort of like not relied on that line recently, and like less since 2015. And they're sort of in this weird, I guess, like mealy mouth in between place, where they're sort of navigating out, and they're in a transitional phase, like from, I guess like the last few years until now. Like, what do you make of this sort of like place that we're in? Do you see this as like an inflection point, or just like a sort of messy transitional phase where these companies are just sort of like mitigating people's frustrations without actually like paying service to them or paying mind to them for real?
Yeah, I would say the latter. I think any move towards, away from free speech, I think comes twofold. One, they know there's a set of people who don't want to hear about the free speech excuse anymore. And two, they understand that there's a set of people who will go out and promote the free speech justification on their behalf. They don't need to say anything because there's whole hordes of people who are willing to go out and make that argument for them. I think the thing that really frustrates me so much about these companies is that they are so reactive, and it's reactive to the media. Like, if you are able to somehow generate a viral post about the harm that's happening to you, or get a reporter to cover it, or somehow it leaks from Facebook, or or a whistleblower shares it, that's when they actually do something, and it's like a weak apology, kind of promise, kind of not to do it again. They never repair the harm. So the people who have been harmed by their failure to protect them never get compensated. They never get like an apology directly to them. It's just kind of like this general apology to the public for having this harm have happened. And then, as soon as the public forgets it, they will do the same thing again, right? There's no change. And you see that's also kind of, for Facebook, it seems like a product strategy. Like, I'm going to test these things, and then people are going to be really in an uproar the first time I do it. If I'm saving your likes, or, trying to track you in some way. But then I'm going to do it again, maybe a year later. And then, like, if the outcry is low enough, I'll keep it. But if it's sharp enough, I may like water it down or get rid of it. But I'm going to keep pushing it until people accept it.
To sort of play the other side for 1 second, like, we have unfortunately arrived at this like sort of weird place where these companies like do, I guess, like filter large amounts of like public discourse and speech. And so even though like that's like unfortunate, we don't want them to be, and it's like, again, like there's like this sort of like anti-democratic component that exists within it. I guess it would be good for them to preserve it within reason, with mind to these sorts of toxic issues of harassment and things like that. Are there ways, like positive ways, that these things can be maintained? Like an idea that comes to mind is like, you've been involved in Patreon, a company. I believe you invested in it, correct? Is that
I
right?
invested in Kit, which was a company that Camille Hirst started that got acquired by Patreon. So I'm a small, I have a small ownership stake.
Are things like that sort of, do they provide a vision of like how to maintain speech without, I guess, like creating a situation where these companies are like responsible for it, and then start to make quasi-government decisions on what like speech is? Do you see those kinds of like smaller things as like a model that we can like look to?
I don't know that much about how Patreon operates, and I don't use it that much, unfortunately. I donate some money once in a while, but I'm not active, so I'm not sure exactly how they do that. I do think that like the amount of work and the difficulty is overblown, right? It's it's pretty straightforward. Like, you set some rules, and then you enforce those rules as consistently as you can. And then people understand the rules, and there'll be some flurry where people are upset and they want to test the rules, or they want to break the rules, and you end up having to suspend them or ban them, and then they come around eventually. Like, the bulk of the people want to be part of part of your service, and they want to be able to use your service, so they will follow your rules if you're clear about them and consistent in enforcing them. If your rules are not being consistently enforced, it's as if you don't have rules. So once you lay down a clear set of rules and values, and people understand what's expected of them, they generally will follow. And it's not like you've got 10 billion people who are not following the rules. It's like, at Reddit, it was like just such a small fraction of the posts that were violating, and it was coming from such a small fraction of the people who use the service. There's only 10% of people actually logged in, and then only 1% of people actually posted, and only some small fraction, basis points of those people were responsible for a lot of the harm. So if you could actually, set some rules and kind of follow the harassment from the harassers, it would be, a pretty easy way to deal with it. But instead, they talk about like the huge volume of posts. I can't remember who did the research that showed that like a lot of misinformation in one specific topic on Facebook came from 12 accounts, right? If you could have shut down those 12 accounts and prevented other accounts from like replacing them, you would have solved a huge set of disinformation.
Yeah. To shift gears for a moment, I've been reading your book, and there's a section I want to read really quickly and sort of ask you a little bit more about. So I just will for a second. Almost all of the partners I learned owned multiple properties, a vineyard in Napa. And for context, in the book, Ellen is talking about the partners at, I believe it's Kleiner Perkins where she works. All the partners own a vineyard in Napa, ski homes in Tahoe, Aspen, New York, townhomes in Boston, empty houses in San Francisco, Los Angeles. Anything was an excuse to buy a home. Uh, Wanting to be near a particular school, wanting to be home for entertaining, wanting a bunker for the apocalypse. And sort of in this section, you go on to talk about how there's this like deep paranoia in Silicon Valley, and there's this deep paranoia among the sort of billionaire class and then the multimillionaire class about the end of the world and going off to, as you say here, specific ranches in New Zealand. And a lot of it just felt like this sort of funny, prescient auguring for like what you sort of called what was going to happen, where you talked about how the bunkers in New Zealand would be hard to get to, who was going to fly people in. New Zealand wouldn't even let these people in. And in many cases, they didn't initially in the pandemic. As the sort of pandemic spiraled out of control, have you sort of seen this paranoia like heighten? And like, are there new sort of like paranoid reactions to the end of the world that still exist that you're seeing?
I feel very grateful. I'm not close to that world anymore. Like I lead a very normal life. Like I have my one place to live, and I'm very comfortable with that. I think I did see like a very sharp divide between people who were successful in tech and in investing and had the ability or already had a second home, and to be able to go someplace where you had a lot of space, where you had outdoor access, where you had the ability to go outside, which a lot of people living in like New York, DC, San Francisco did not. That was a huge divide. I think we see it with people who are going back to work. If you're somebody who has an extra office space where you can be sheltered from noise within your household, if you have kids and you have a nanny who can take care of them, it gives you a very different work from home experience than people who don't, who are working from their bed and they don't have any kind of work home life divide because everything is happening from the same room, from the same spot. It can cause a lot more anxiety and stress, and that is something that people who have the space and who have the resources don't have, and who like you see the divide in how much wealth was created and how little of it went beyond like the top 10% of the population.
Yeah, instead of, I guess, like being distributed out, it went to harebrained plans of like gun stockpiles and like underground bunkers and things like that. I mean, among other things, are there any like particularly absurd contingency plans and like I guess like bunker situations that you came across, or like any like really funny ones?
No, I think there was one person who was on the Reddit board who like they were making fun of, but I can't even, like, it was just so ridiculous. I can't even remember what it was, but it was like, I was joking about the New Zealand and they're like, oh, this guy has one. He has a New Zealand bunker and it's like 1,200 feet underground. Like it's a bunker underground in case of some kind of bombing. It was just, I can't even remember what else.
Yeah, it's sort of, I guess, like in the way that these companies like recreate quasi governments. It's funny that some of these people adopt the sort of mentality of creating their own like systems of government and like government like contingencies. You had this other example too in the book about people joking about stockpiling Tamiflu in front of you, but only for the senior partners, which you weren't. Yeah,
it wasn't a joke. They were. It was. It was a wake up call. I mean, it wasn't like I felt like I was part, but they talked about everybody being a family. But then when it came down to stockpiling Tamiflu, only the managing partners had access, and everybody else, like, they were thrown off the Titanic. They weren't gonna save us.
You write about how these kinds of billionaires and like multi-millionaires were, in a lot of cases, like often, sexist and discriminatory in just a myriad of ways. And, these experiences, I think, played a part, correct me if I'm wrong, but in motivating you to start Project Include, in addition to the discrepancies and diversity that you saw. Can you explain what that is and what the mission is for people who are less familiar and what it is exactly that you guys do?
Yeah, a group of 8 of us, all women from different backgrounds, with tech experience. We were sitting around, like I had just been forced to resign from Reddit, and I'd taken a little bit of time off. And then we were trying to figure out, like, well, what is going on with the tech world? Like, we've got all these problems, and now we have all these companies, and they were doing these unconscious bias training where they would have somebody come in and talk to them for half an hour, maybe an hour if you're lucky, maybe an hour and a half. And these companies would then do a big press release like, we are now inclusive, we had this training, and we're so proud of ourselves that we're going to do a big press release about it. And there'll be like one press release every month and then every 2 weeks. And it was just something that we were all so frustrated with. Like, obviously this isn't going to solve it. Having 30-minute training or an hour and a half of training is not going to fix all of these problems. And we started talking about, well, what would really solve these problems? And we came up with a list of like almost 90 different things that companies should be doing. And also like the frameworks for how to think of these problems, because the problems are always changing. They're never, there's always something new that's going to happen. So how should you be thinking about, hiring? How should you be thinking about like these 8 different areas of how you run a company? And then we put it on a website and we said, okay, this is for everyone to learn from. And people were really receptive to it. They thought it was really helpful. They wanted to learn more. And, I ended up, kind of working with everybody to put it into an actual nonprofit. And now we do research. We've released a report on like how the pandemic has affected workplaces. They've gone remote, and there's actually a lot of harm and harassment, and it's happening to people who are most marginalized by their companies. They are feeling more harm and harassment since the pandemic. We wrote about how disabled people are experiencing the workplace since the pandemic and before, how ableism infects workplaces. And then for both of these reports, we're very intent on like, what are things that you should be doing? Like, here are our recommendations, and here are ways to solve these problems within your workplace. We've also done cohorts of CEOs where we have them sit and try to help them work through like how you think about diversity and inclusion in your startup, and what are ways that you're going to push forward on it. So we do a lot of database research, we do these cohorts, and then we've done some qualitative research as well, combined with the data research, the survey-based research, to kind of highlight these issues and to share recommendations and try to help people with very actionable solutions.
Since your lawsuit against Kleiner Perkins and then starting Project Include, I think that there's been a sort of rough tonal and sentiment shift kind of in like people being more sober and like willing to understand these kinds of issues in Silicon Valley and how people are harassed, discriminated against, not treated equally. But there also has been, I don't know if I would say like markedly little progress, but like there certainly like leaves something to be desired in how things have shifted at all. Either way, like you still have to go forward, but like, are you still as hopeful, or do you feel like a bit beaten down and I don't know, to use an internet term, black pilled, or like nihilistic about the direction of how things are going in Silicon Valley?
It depends on the day. It really depends on the day. Like you look at stuff, you look at Spotify and you're just like, I don't, like, it's just like, what has to happen? Like, what do people need to see in order to, what do people need to have happen in order to do the right thing? Right. And,
Yeah.
and there are people who are like, oh, well, it's not so bad. It was this one thing that pushed me over the edge, but it took forever to get there. And you're kind of like, well, how do we get people to act more quickly? And also, how do we get people to sacrifice? Like, yes, we understand, like, you're going to lose 11 million listeners. Like, are you really going to lose all of them? And also, like, do you really want them if they're going to go out and like do terrible things and be, perpetuating this horrible pandemic on people? Like, what is the end goal? It's not just getting more users and building up your stock price. It's got to be more than that. Like, where are your values?
So you do think Joe Rogan like shouldn't have a place on a platform like Spotify?
He has so many places. I think like Spotify wants to hide behind this free speech idea, but they are paying him. It's not like they're this empty platform and everybody can share their content. They're paying him $100 million, right? It's like Twitter saying, "Oh, well, we're going to pay somebody," but it's just like, but it's not like amplifying them or anything. It's not like we're taking an active role. We're just this neutral, fair, free speech platform, and but like they're they're amplifying it in a way and enabling it in a way that is goes beyond just sharing the content. They're paying for it, and they're and that bears even more responsibility.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. So
I'm curious. You seem like that this might be a line too far for you.
No, well, I don't have strong opinions on it. Like the one thing I've like thought about with it, or one of the few things I've thought about with it is like Rogan. I think that there are definitely people that deserve to be deplatformed. I think that, like people who are overtly um, white nationalists or like believe in like white power, things like that, like that those sort of beliefs are like inherently violent. Like the physical removal of people from like the land that you believe in yours, like just necessarily implies violence if you don't overtly outright state it. Rogan, I see both sides of it in the sense that he I don't know. He seems like more amenable to, I guess, like having his platform or his content taken down where he's like made mistakes and things like that. But then I don't know. I don't know at what point someone deserves forgiveness or not. So yeah, I don't really have strong opinions one way or the other.
I mean, I think we as a society, it's hard for us as a society. Like for me, it's like, has he done something to really repair the harm? Right. He's done this kind of apology, and it was a good apology. Like he said the right words, but did he actually do anything? Like, did he try to educate himself? Did he try to contribute to other, to educating people? Is he, going to, not share that content going forward? Maybe, but did he take down that content from other platforms like YouTube? No, he didn't, right? So how genuine is that apology if you're still allowing it on other platforms and you're only getting rid of it from the one that you got caught and called out for? Like, where is, how are you going to fix your mistake in a way that shows me that you've actually learned and you're not going to do it again, and that you're genuinely trying to fix the harm that you caused?
One thing I've kind of been thinking about too, just like reading your book and like thinking about the work that you do, is inclusion is definitely important, and representation does I think is like very key in like mitigating some of these issues. But I guess like I wonder about like the limits sometimes and like how those limits can be overcome. There was like a particularly good New York Times opinion piece that came out during the Black Lives Matter protests that like pointed at all of these districts and cities and state governments and local governments across the country that have Black leadership, but the needs of the Black communities in them are not served well. And some of that is like by things that exist far beyond the reach of the politicians. It's like power structures of how capital flows in and out of these cities. It's like from state governments who don't care about what a specific city might want. There's like always tension between the government of Houston and Texas and the government of Texas, for example. But in other cases, it was politicians sort of capitulating to policies that weren't going to be helpful for their constituents because they existed in this broader order, and they chose not to make these sorts of decisions. And I wonder, for example, if you did have like a Black Mark Zuckerberg, in some ways, like there would definitely be some things that would probably be better, but at the same time, you'd be beholden to the sort of same incentive structure. I mean, like, one, do you think that's the case? And two, like, how do you get past like the limits of just like simply having, a more diverse workforce?
I think it's one, it's like it can't just be the one Mark Zuckerberg who's Black. It's got to be like a whole, it's got to be 10% of the Mark Zuckerbergs should be Black, right? So if you're not dependent on that one person to be the role model who has to carry on his or her shoulders, like the whole obligation to show people like the way that it should be done, and it's just this one way, and it may be that the one person that you are dependent on does believes in exceptionalism, or believes in for Asians like the model minority. So it's got to be like there has to be a critical mass of people. I'm not sure. I forgot the second part of your question. Sorry.
Oh, no, that got at it totally. As I was reading your book too, I was sort of thinking about the position that you and your female colleagues at Kleiner Perkins were put in, and you guys. So, like, first and foremost, like the discrimination seemed to be very clearly one of sexism and like very gender based, but at the same time, the senior partners are able to take advantage of y'all's junior status. Do you think that there is versions of this dynamic play out like in a number of workplaces? Do you think that like if you guys had been able to have like I guess like more power as junior partners, not necessarily through the business itself, but just like over management, whether it be through things like unions or things like that, that could help resolve these sorts of issues if management isn't willing to listen to create or fix these sort of problems, can like workers who are a little bit more diverse right now like help solve these problems by getting more power, by getting like a seat on the board potentially, or things like that?
I think the power was so ingrained and so concentrated at Kleiner, like, and in VC firms in general. I'm I don't like, I believe in unions, but I don't know if it would work, because they would just they didn't care. Like they saw us as expendable. They would get rid of all of us and bring in all new people. I don't know that and we see that happening in these other companies too, where the organizers get pushed out. And just like the massive wealth and the relationships, like part of it was also, it wasn't just Kleiner, it was the whole structure of the VC industry, where you depended on relationships to be shown the deals that were hot, and those were the deals that would get successful. And then you would owe that person and you would bring them into your own deal that was hot. And it was like these tight relationships within a very small group of people was where a lot of the power manifested. And as a junior person, like, you couldn't get into those circles unless you had been given certain opportunities. And I'm not sure how you unionize those opportunities. Like, you need to give me a board seat, or like those opportunities. It's very easy to say, well, the CEO doesn't want me. Right? There was a whole list of like negative feedback from CEOs that they pulled together about me, because they were the investors, and they could and they could. So I don't know how you get into that structure. In the tech company world, it's like, you have these massive numbers of workers who are unionizing, and they can strike and shut everything down. I think there's a lot of work that you do as a junior person that's not necessarily fundamental to the business, and that if you didn't do, it wouldn't shut the firm down for a very long time.
Yeah. Do you feel like, I know that you said you're kind of out of this world, but like since your lawsuit, like, do you feel as though, from things you've heard, that the climate on these things at places like Kleiner and companies and other VCs is a little bit better now, or people just like sneakier about trying to figure out how to do it without getting caught, or is there like a trend in a better direction?
I think the trend in a better direction is like people who are not from the traditional demographic getting funded, right? So you see like a lot of women GPs, women general partners who are starting and running funds. You see Black men and women running and starting funds. You see Latinx men and women, but it's such small. They're large amounts of funds. I think there's certain funds that are raising over $100 million, but when it's in the grand scheme of the size of venture capital industry as a whole, it's not that much. And then when you see some of the folks who are, kind of locked into this system and structure and way of working, as you mentioned earlier, they fall into the structure and they're not investing in a wider diversity of founder teams or companies. It is a little bit disheartening, but I do think we are seeing more people who eventually will break out, and we are seeing lots of funds. I'm an investor in Precursor Ventures. I love that they are investing in a very diverse and inclusive way, and their founding teams are incredibly diverse. I think when we see more groups like them, like Harlem Capital, like all in Hamilton and Backstage Capital, like these are the firms that are going to help change what happens. But there's so few of them, and they have relatively small amounts. I think Andreessen Horowitz just raised $8 or $9 billion, and we're talking about funds that are raising 10, 40, maybe 100, 150 million. Like it's their capacity to change things is relatively small.
And so just so I'm understanding, right, like by funding these companies led by different types of people, ultimately like you create the next like class of like founders and executives who come onto these companies, right, and like make different sorts of decisions.
Yeah, and and I've invested in a lot of founders who come from different backgrounds, and I think they're generally more thoughtful about diversity and inclusion. They're more thoughtful about the products that they make. They're more thoughtful about about how they build cultures. They're more thoughtful about who they hire and how they promote and how they build like this kind of community around their companies and around their teams. And I think and that's going to change the world. Like the CEOs that we work with, most of them in Project Include, like they want to have diverse and inclusive companies. I think, like a majority of CEOs want that. They don't want to be the company where people hate coming to work and where people don't feel like they belong. But many of them aren't willing to do the work or they don't know what to do. And I think if you can show the way, because you've got somebody who has been thinking about it, who has that lived experience, who is actually bringing people on board, who can give the feedback and help make things even better, like that's going to change. Like when we see these companies being successful, we know that the workforce is becoming more and more interested in diversity and inclusion. I think it's like around 75% of new graduates think that diversity and inclusion is a very important part of what they want in the companies that they work for. And that kind of change in perspective from even 10 years ago is going to force companies to adapt. And when they understand that like these other companies that have more diverse leadership teams, CEOs who aren't from the traditional demographic, that's going to lead the way, and that's going to drive people to invest differently. But it's just taken so long. There's so much data that shows that diversity makes for better boards, it makes for better financial decisions, it makes for better financial performance. Like there are all of these reasons, and then there's a whole other set of data showing how it's the fair thing to do, how it's making up for all sorts of harms that have happened for hundreds of years, and yet people still can't do the actual, take the actual actions to make change happen. It can be very frustrating.
One thing that's kind of changed from the time, like since you wrote your book to now, is that there was like a sort of denial of issues of diversity and inclusion and like discrimination being just at all. They were like, yo, like this isn't happening. It's not here. And now there's not like an overcorrection, but almost an overcorrection that companies have like figured out that this isn't just something that they need to fix, but like kind of like you said, like, or you hinted at, like creating the appearance that they are fixing them, and they almost can weaponize that to launder their own reputations. You kind of saw that with like Black Lives Matter, with like all sorts of random companies putting out these statements, not backed by any sort of like intentional or meaningful action. And it's almost going the opposite direction where companies are using this like offensively. I don't know if you saw, but REI put out this podcast. It was like a sort of anti-union podcast where the chief diversity officer and the CEO were talking, and they introed it by saying their pronouns and saying the indigenous land that they were speaking on, before going on and talking about why a union might inhibit their ability to handle issues of social justice in a sort of vague way. I mean, how do you think that, like, how are ways that we can stop like this kind of encroachment from happening, this overcorrection going in a direction that helps companies at the expense of the people who are supposed to be helped to begin with, the people who are oppressed, the marginalized people, and people like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are smart enough to look through it. I think the people who kind of wave those flags are appealing in some ways to the right, where they can say, look, all these companies are doing all this work, like we don't need to do more work, right? Like haven't, these groups already been protected and given so many unfair advantages now, like we've done enough. But I think the people who are actually interested in justice and in fairness can look through that. They're not, they may have been fooled earlier, but by the time the 10th company said Black Lives Matter and treated their Black employees poorly, or didn't allow what was it, Starbucks didn't allow them to wear the hat that said Black Lives Matter, people can see through it, and they really are looking for consistency in actions and more meaningful actions, right? Are you actually hiring people at your leadership level? Do you have people on your board who are from diverse backgrounds? Are you actually paying your workers fairly? Like, these are things that people actually care about. I think the kind of the whole indigenous land acknowledgement, a lot of people think it is very perfunctory, and it's like, if you're not actually doing things for the indigenous people who are still on the land, then you better not be making the land acknowledgement, because it really is just a bunch of words you're saying.
They wanted to hear from you, and so just as couple last few questions here, I wanted to ask you them, starting with, and this one is from an audience member in Freeland, Washington, who asked, before the rise of social media, newspapers were responsible for the integrity of news and information. With big tech taking over, they now bear the onus of ensuring that information is shared ethically and responsibly. Ultimately, social media companies need to be accountable to the public, not stockholders or people with twisted agendas. And I also just kind of want to say, I thought this question was interesting in that it got to the contradictions of the current order that we talked about earlier, where you have these for-profit businesses who do affect all of the public, but at the same time are exempt from democratic accountability. Not that politicians, I guess, are immune from these kinds of issues, but at the same time, they do have to grovel their constituents every so often. Silicon Valley doesn't have to do that.
Yeah, it's been interesting because, like, newspapers, there are certain guidelines on the press. There are guidelines on broadcast. Like, that whole FCC has been, running a whole set of restrictions and regulations on what people can broadcast. So I don't. I don't think that's I think that's, potentially a good solution where, okay, we have this regulation that kind of regulates what you can, what you can say, and you can't just broadcast whatever you feel like. And maybe it's around amplification too. And you have a different set of rules for what you can amplify, but it's really like, you need to take some more responsibility for the information that you're sharing, especially when it's hitting so many people and when you have such an impact on like what gets heard and what doesn't get heard. You're not this neutral platform anymore, and you need to take some responsibility. And since you can't, we need to come in and put in some restrictions on what you're able to do, because you're not using it responsibly. And it doesn't necessarily, we've seen like this has, all of these media outlets, the broadcasting networks are private companies, but they are held to this public standard through the FCC.
Another question that several of our audience members asked about was if there are any sort of like international examples of countries sorting out these problems of diversity and inclusion, and then also the disinformation and just like toxic effect of social media, noxious effect on the population. Are there any sort of good models internationally abroad that you've seen either by companies or governments?
I don't know. I feel like all of these countries have been impacted by like by the social media platforms, right? Like, you know, Germany had this very restrictive, um, you know, government regulation around, around, around hate and writing or talking about Nazi power, and I think all of that has kind of been eroded by the rise of white nationalism again in Germany. So I don't know of any countries. I'm kind of curious. Even New Zealand has had, I think it was a set of its politicians resign because they didn't want to deal with the hate and harassment they were experiencing on social media. So I don't know of a country that has really figured this out. I think this problem is broad and global, and if we're able to regulate the platforms, I think it will help. I think, going back to one of your earlier questions, it is interesting when companies talk about free speech, but they're willing to, censor content in other countries, right? As soon as the government says you're not allowed to talk about this, or you're not allowed to talk about that, or we're going to shut you down, they, for the most part, respond pretty quickly.
Do you think that the sort of models, I forget specifically which European countries it was, but where they sort of, I want to say it was like Germany and maybe someone else, where Facebook sort of threatened to pull service and they were like, yeah, let's go ahead. I don't know. Do you think that we could approach these companies in that way? I think that, lawmakers are very skittish from approaching things that aggressively here, but like, would that be effective?
I think we've seen, like, Facebook is an engine driven by users and engagement. And anything that would threaten the growth of those numbers and threaten their stock price and would threaten like the system that they've created, where they've got employees who are dependent on the stock price going up. They've got executives and a whole set of investors who are pushing that stock price to go up. Then it is a very credible threat, and one that is hitting companies like Facebook where it hurts. So I do think that would be very effective. I do wonder though, like, when you have, bad leaders who are able to make those threats and then, have, and maybe they could force people to publish disinformation. Maybe they could force these conversations that we want to have that are, kind of the free exchange of ideas. I think the platforms have and will continue to be willing to to shut those conversations down, which are the wrong conversations to shut down.
The last question I had is if anyone is sort of interested in looking into these issues more and like getting a better handle on like how things can be fixed and like what the problems are and how to address them, like what resources or books or documentaries or anything would you recommend them to that you think are particularly good or informative?
Oh, that is such a hard question.
No problem. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I will say your book
there.
is a good place to start.
Yeah, it gives you one snapshot into like behind the scenes, and I tried to be as open as I could remember things and that I thought would be useful and interesting to people. And it's behind the scenes. I think I know there are a lot, but I there's a lot online. People who are talking about their experiences at these different places. I think Ev Williams, all of these leaders, Ev Williams, Dick Costello, the head of 8chan, all of the people, all of these founders and CEOs have now kind of regretted the free-for-all kind of free speech, argued for platform free-for-alls. And I think Ev did a great piece in the New York Times as an op-ed. Dick, I think his email to his team saying like, we have done a bad job on harassment and our users are paying for it. I think that was a good email to read. Kind of like that inside view is very helpful, but I think, I don't know how much you really need to read about it, right? Like you've got all these leaders who have been running these companies saying this is a huge problem. it's more like, how do you move forward? And it's, I think, I think that's a hard question that, we're going to be struggling with for a while, because I don't think, as you said, I don't think our, our government has a stomach to really push against the people who donate them so much money to get them elected. And I don't think they know what to do either.
Well, thank you so much for being able to do this. I really appreciate it. If our audience wants to read more of your work or anything like that, where can they find you online?
On Twitter, I'm EKP. We have a lot of work that's under Project Include on Medium, and also on our website under Project Include Research. We have all our data reports. I'm trying to think. I've written a bunch of stuff on other, if you Google, I've written for Time Magazine, New York Times op-eds, Recode, Wired Magazine. So there's a lot out there, and hopefully that's helpful to you. I think there are some other great people that you can follow on Twitter. God, I know their handles, but I can't remember their names in real life. But maybe I'll tweet out a list of people that I think you should follow on Twitter who have been really thoughtful about this topic.
And I referenced your book a lot, so I'll just say it again. It's called Reset: My Fight for Inclusion and Lasting Change. Yeah, thanks so much for your time today, though. Take care.
Yeah, it's always great to talk to you, Ali. Thank you for your time.
Thanks. And I want to say thank you again to our sponsor, Beneficial State Bank. Thank you guys for joining. You can follow Mother Jones on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter to keep up with our stories and future live stream events that we might do. Our website's motherjones.com/live. Thanks.